Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this wonderful Sabbath day, and the opportunity to gather together through this medium and worship together and praise you together and learn together, Lord. And Father, I just invite the Holy Spirit's presence to be with Sister Elaine as she shares a message with us. But also, I ask for the Holy Spirit's presence with each one of us individually, Lord, along with the holy angels that you've promised are there to help us understand, Lord, these things. There's so much, and some of it seems so difficult, Lord, but you can give us clarity. So I just pray that you give Sister Elaine clarity of mind, and that you would anoint her with the live coal from the altar, Lord, and anoint us also that we might hear and understand. This is my prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Are we doing Proverbs?
What was that?
Are we doing Proverbs, or did you want to do the?
Oh no, I thought we were doing the Egypt study right now. That's what I put in the email.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Sorry.
Okay. Back to the beginning. So we've been kind of working on the history. We've touched on it a few times, and then also, just in what we've been hearing out of the school in Portugal, started looking into it and trying to put the history actually on a line. So some of it's already been done, and I'm going to try to do a little bit of a review based on this particular study that we worked on Wednesday night, and to not go through some of the details, but try to just give the highlights to it until we pick up where we left off, though I've kind of added a few things to this since then. So in looking at the things, listening to the things and learning what they've been teaching and going through in Portugal, in this history of 1798 to leading up to 1840, August 11th, 1840, and then 41. And if you go back to Germany and see the presentation where Elder Parmenter, showed that Uriah Smith was right, it's been able to develop a structure that shows the line of the Millerites and then our history here with the two time of the ends. So we know that the second time of the end, this history here is a structure and it's an application. But in doing so, it drew the studies back to look at what Uriah Smith said, and knowing that he got his work from Josiah Litch, what Josiah Litch said, and that at the beginning of the chapter of Daniel and Revelation in Daniel 11, it tells us that it's a literal prophecy. So to go through and read it, it's to read the literal history, and then following it through to the part that had not yet been fulfilled. So Josiah Litch, in his writings, tells us that the king of the south is Egypt, the king of the north is Syria, and that France is the him. What we do know is that the France, him, he went on this Egyptian expedition, and that was another study we did a couple weeks ago. And I included the notes to both studies in all the emails. So if there's anybody that's not on the email list, just in that those that are, forward it to those if you could. So both files were attached to the email. In addition to, because there's so many, I think of the right word to use for this, so many different things to look at on this study, and this is just a portion of it. This is just taking the history and putting it on a line. But then there's the looking at Islam more specifically, then looking at Putin more specifically as it pertains to his resurrection and then his deadly wound and his death. So we saw that Napoleon went on this Egyptian expedition to try to block trade from between Britain and India, and to try to take control of the Mediterranean himself. And in doing so, he has some resistance when he gets to Egypt. And that's what Josiah Litch says is the king of the south, Egypt, pushing at him, Napoleon. He pushes at him, but there's not a defeat. Napoleon is still there. Napoleon then goes from there on his expedition to go. There are several battles, takes Cairo, and a couple others, and then he goes on this expedition to go. There was a spot in there where he goes to look at what they call the Canal of the Pharaohs. So it's pre-Suez Canal built, but there was a canal that was being built, and he wanted to see the possibilities of blocking off Britain by not being able to, because going down from Britain all the way around Africa and up into Egypt was long and dangerous in spots. But he wanted to be able to come through Egypt, come down through the Red Sea, and then go over into India. He wanted to increase relations with India and decrease relations with India, between India and Britain. So in the first study that we worked on, the one that actually covered 1798 to 1801, the Egyptian expedition, we had a few notes in there, and they're in that file that I sent, because I was, what Elder Parmenter had suggested, what is the connection with India, and the best that I can understand, that Napoleon went to weaken Britain's access to India. And we see the king of the north and the king of the south now that want to control the Middle East and control the oil. And there are some of those articles that I posted, one in particular, but I can't remember which file it was, but we see that Russia, Putin has wanted to get in his influence with the crown prince and try to take the crown prince from dependence on the United States to be sided with Russia.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
In 1798 history, it's Egypt and Turkey that are king of the north and king of the south, right?
Uh-huh.
What's their connection to India?
Yeah, I was getting there.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't know about their connection to India. I don't have that yet.
Yeah, in our time, we're using the king of the north and king of the south to see their connection to Middle East, right?
Yeah, well, what I've come to see, and I've been kind of collaborating with a little bit with Brother Atabo in Africa as well, because I was re-listening to number 9, I think it was, of the IPR camp meeting, and just really focusing on what Elder Parminder was saying. And it dawned on me, however the Lord opened it up or whatever, but in this history here, 1798 to 1801, or actually going on forward, in this history here, all of it, that the king of the south is Egypt, the king of the north, Josiah Litch says, is Syria controlled by Turkey. It's the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was Muslim. They were Muslims, maybe not all, but they were Muslim. So Egypt was Islam, and Syria was Islam, or Turkey was Islam. So what we saw is that the literal is that the king of the north and the king of the south are both Islam. So then what we see in our history is that the king of the north and the king of the south, by proxy, who were they trying to control? So by proxy, the king of the north and the king of the south are Islam, if that made sense. So,
Can I ask a question?
yes.
When you just, by proxy, the king of the north and the king of the south are both Islam, in our time, 1989, that's because Syria is a ally to Russia. Is that why?
Right. They both have their allies in the region. And that's what we see as we go through these.
Yeah.
We're going to review the history of the Millerite history and get to 1831 to 1833 history specifically. But then we're going to look at a couple of different articles that walk us through the Syrian War today. And so it's still a battle. I may be wording it wrong, but it's still a battle between two different factions of Islam, with Russia controlling one and the United States controlling the other, or being allied with.
So if I can just ask,
Yeah.
the allies are like, what's that country? Oh shoot, it's escaped my mind. There's Saudi Arabia and there's Iran. That's what it is. So Iran is king of the south because it's ally with Russia, and Saudi Arabia is king of the north because it's ally with USA. Is that right or wrong?
That's the way I'm understanding it.
Okay, I just wanted that clarification.
Yeah, that's the way I'm understanding it.
Okay.
And so it's this battle between the king of the north and the king of the south, but it's a proxy war. So what we saw in this history here is it was literally two different factions of Islam. I don't know if Islam or Muslim is the way to say it, but it was two different factions of, if you were to look at it today, two different factions in the Middle East, in which we see today now between the Sunni and the Shias, and the Russia siding with the Shias and the United States siding with the Sunnis. But there's a lot more complications than just that. That's just a real simple, a real simplistic look at it, but there's a lot more complications to it. But what was seen, so we know that Napoleon went to weaken Britain's access to India and to strengthen his own. So, and there are things that I don't have in this study, things that, and plus I don't have all the answers, but I know that the Afghanistan war, which was 10 years prior, plays a role, because in the history of that war, that's where you have Russia coming in, and there was a few of those articles have to do with during the Cold War, leading up to the Afghan war, and then the issue of Russia then leaving, because in this time here, Napoleon wound up, he goes into Egypt, he's pushed at by the king of the south, but he's still there, he's not defeated, he's pushed at, but then he starts to go up towards Syria and work his way up into Syria to gain control there. There's a few battles that he wins, and then the king of the north, or the Sultan, comes at him like a whirlwind, who is actually allied with the British, comes at him like a whirlwind, and then that sends him back to Egypt and then eventually back to France. So that's kind of where we're picking up to try to review just a few things here, but then he goes back to France. So we know we see Russia, after the Afghanistan war, the Soviet Union, leave the region, but in doing so, when the trouble that Napoleon brought here is what eventually the activities here, which is part of these notes, the activities that took place here that led up to this proxy war here between Egypt and Turkey, where there was a battle for Syria. So what we're trying to trace is these issues here that brought us to 1831. And I don't have yet that history in between here. What I have is this history that I'm working on, but this history still needs to be looked at as well to understand the steps on a line to bring us to here. And one of those steps, though, we do know is the power vacuum that was left in Egypt, that that eventually led to the problem, to the Syrian War. So there's a power vacuum here that brings up this rise of Islam. So this just tells you, this just here covers that he leaves then Egypt. After he leaves, because we're going to try to just skip through the first few slides, and they're in your notes. It was all gone through on Wednesday, and those are all posted. So Kleber is the one that followed. It was that Napoleon left in charge. He winds up in a battle because they try to come up and take Cairo again. Kleber led the outnumbered French troops to attack the Ottoman army at Heliopolis, decisively winning the battle and enabling them to re-enter Cairo and to bring an end to the revolt. So there was an uprising again to try to take back Cairo by the Ottoman Empire, by the Pasha. So okay, so this is Kleber. This is Kleber's successor. He actually was a French officer, married a Muslim woman, converted to Muslim, to Islam. We'll read this one. Let's see. He turned Muslim. He was determined to maintain the occupation, the French occupation, and administered at first a tolerably settled country, although he lacked the prestige of his two predecessors. That would be Kleber and then Napoleon. In 1801, a threefold invasion of Egypt began. So you've got this threefold invasion. You've got British troops, and the Ottomans also advancing on Syria, and then you have British Indian forces. They all come against him. The French garrison in Cairo capitulated, and in June, Minot himself at Alexandria capitulated as well in September. So that was the end of that French occupation there. The brief episode of the French occupation was to be significant for Egypt in several ways. The arrival of a European army, accompanied by scholars and scientists, appropriately inaugurated the impact of the West, which was to be felt increasingly afterward. Egypt, insulated for centuries by the Mamluk and Ottoman sultanates, was no longer immune from European influence. It had become an object of the contending policies of France and Britain, a part of the Eastern question. And I have notes on the Eastern question that are included as well to talk about the powers that were, this is the Eastern question, the great powers of Europe that were working on this issue when it came to Islam. And it talks about the concert of Europe, known as the Congress system or Vienna system, was dominated by five great powers: Europe, Austria, France, Prussia, Russia, and the United Kingdom. And then it refers to here the sick man, characterized as the sick man. The sick man of Europe is described as the Ottoman Empire. So this Eastern question was these great powers and what to do about the Ottoman Empire. This one leads us to when the Pasha winds up. This is the period of time after Napoleon's gone. The consequence for Egypt was the effect of the French occupation on internal politics. Mamluk, and I put out notes on the Mamluk as well in a couple of studies a week ago, I think, and who they were. But they were the ones that were the radicals in Egypt that were dominating. And so the Mamluk ascendancy was fatally weakened. Murad Bey, who had made his peace with the French, died shortly before their capitulation in 1801, and Ibrahim Bey, who returned to Egypt with the Ottomans, had henceforward little power. The new Mamluk leader, Uthman Bey al-Bardisi, died in 1806, and Mohammed Bey al-Alfi died 1807. Former retainers of Murad headed rival factions and had, in any case, to reckon with the British and Ottoman occupation forces. In March 1803, the British troops were evacuated in accordance with the Treaty of Amiens. And I noticed that last night, I didn't catch on at the beginning of the study, but Sister Brody was working on, I think she was more focused when I tuned in to the treaty that was the articles that were later that were talking about August 11th, 1840. So these treaties are all going to have significant points, but I only have so much in the study so far. So, but the Ottomans, determined to reassert their control over Egypt, remained, establishing their power through a viceroy and occupying army. So the Ottomans are still going to want to have control over Egypt, but they're going to put a viceroy in charge. And that eventually comes to, in 1805, Muhammad Ali, who then also gets the title of Pasha. And a Pasha is a title of a man of high rank or office in the Ottoman Empire. It was the highest official title of honor in the Ottoman Empire. So, and so Muhammad Ali, who during the ensuing two years cautiously strengthened his own position at the expense of both the Mamelukes and the Ottomans. So he's working to increase and strengthen his own position. And this is all as a result of the power vacuum that was left when Napoleon left. So you got, in 1805, Muhammad Ali becomes the Pasha, and at the height of his rule, he controlled Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, Sudan, and parts of Arabia, and the entire Levant. And this is at the height of his rule, because he was seeking to grow in significance there and in power. Though not a modern nationalist, he is regarded as the founder of modern Egypt. He was a military commander in the Albanian Ottoman force sent to recover Egypt from French occupation under Napoleon. Following Napoleon's withdrawal, Muhammad Ali rose to power through a series of political maneuvers, and in 1805, he was named Wali, Viceroy of Egypt, and gained the rank of Pasha. He also initiated a violent purge of the Mamelukes, consolidating his rule and permanently ending the Mamluk hold over Egypt. His attempts at suppressing the Greek rebellion failed decisively, however, following an intervention by the European powers at Navarino. In 1831, Muhammad Ali waged war against the Sultan, and that's the war we want to eventually get to, is 1831. So the Greek rebellion, that was the Greek War of Independence, where the Greeks wanted to separate off from the Ottoman Empire and be independent of the Ottoman Empire. And he played a role in that, but it was in that actually brought the European powers that we know eventually are the ones in 1841 that the Ottoman Empire surrenders their power to. So his attempt at suppressing the Greek rebellion failed decisively. However, following an intervention by the European powers, in 1831, he waged war against the Sultan, capturing Syria, crossing into Anatolia, and directly threatening Constantinople, but Western powers threatened him to retreat. He did the same invasion against the Ottoman Empire in 1840, because there were two parts to that civil war, 1831 to 1833, and 1839 to 1841, when he defeated again the Ottomans and had a free way to capture Istanbul. So, and I didn't cover that part of it on that first slide, where you had the 2 years of 1831 to 1833, a 6-year break, and then the same battle again. He's battling for Syria. And in that second battle, 1839 to 1841, right in the middle was August 11th, 1840, Josiah Litch's prediction. So it has a lot of implications for us to understand and dig into this history to understand, because what we saw on August 11th, 1840 was a restraint of Islam. We saw, it was an election year. We saw that the methodology that was used was confirmed, and that there was a wonderful impetus given to the work. We know that the Syrian War today is going to be a 10-year war, and it will end in 2021. And so here we are in 2020, and FFA is making a prediction that Islam will strike, whereas the methodology shows us that there's a restraint on Islam. But the implications of the prayer that was put out, that we pray for the movement, for the increase of light on Islam, whether it be prior to July 18 or after, based on Josiah Litch, I think it's something to be had before. And that after the methodology would be proved. So for some years, Mehmet Ali, that's the Pasha of Egypt, had manifested a disposition to throw off the Turkish yoke and maintain an independent government. He gradually increased in power and extended his conquest, wresting one province after another from the Sultan, adding to his own dominions. In 1839, a war broke out between Mehmet and the Sultan, in which the Sultan's army were cut up and his fleet taken by Mehmet and carried to Egypt, which he refused to surrender and to return to the Sultan, threatening to burn it if an attempt should be made to take it. So this is a map showing his the territory that he did have and then how he increased it. And we're going to see on a couple of other slides some of the steps that brought them to this increase. And it involves the Wahhabis along the way as well. So this is Muhammad II. This was the Sultan of that time. You had the Pasha of Egypt until 1849, and the Sultan, I believe, was till 39. I don't remember where it said it. I think it was 1839. So these are the two that were in power during that history. So let's see here. Shortly, the Eastern question with Russia, England, and France, and military problems arising from mutinous janissaries and factious ulemas. He also faced numerous internal conflicts with Egyptians. Wahhabis, Serbians, Albanians, Greeks, and Syrians had administrative problems from rebellious pashas who would have fain have found new kingdoms on the ruins of the House of Osman. So that was what Muhammad had to deal with in his place. He understood the growing problem of the state and the approaching overthrow of the monarchy and began to deal with the problems as he saw them. And there was, I think it was, I don't remember if it was in this study, but might have been the previous one, but there was a couple of 100 years where the Sultan stopped attending the councils. It was called the Divan, if I'm saying that right, but it was the state councils. They stopped attending and they attribute the decline in their power to that. So he understood the growing problems. I think it's right actually in this one right here. He personally set an example of reform by regularly attending. So he started attending it, and it was this that they had stopped attending it that they attribute to the cause of the decline of the empire. So here's a map of the Ottoman Empire. And I don't have a timeline on this, but it's at the greatest extent in everything that they controlled. Areas that they were tributary, and then what was actually their empire. So they started with military expansion. This one here was pretty important because it talks about Ibrahim, which was the Muhammad Ali's son, the Pasha's son, that he goes, let's see, we'll read it. In Arabia, the dominion of Islam's holy cities, Mecca and Medina, by puritanical Wahhabi Muslims, was a serious embarrassment to the Ottoman Sultan, who was the titular overlord of the Arabian territory of the Hijaz and the leading Muslim sovereign. At the invitation of the Sultan, so the Sultan, who did reign until 1839, I was right on that, 1808 to 1839, at the invitation of the Sultan, Muhammad Ali, that's the Pasha of Egypt, sent an expedition to Arabia that between 1811 and 1813 expelled the Wahhabis from the Hijaz. In a further campaign, 1816 to 1818, Ibrahim Pasha, that's his son, defeated the Wahhabis in their homeland of Najad. I'm not sure how to say that. And in 1820 to 21, Muhammad Ali sent an expedition up the Nile River and conquered much of what is now the northern portion of Sudan. By so doing, he made himself master of one of the principal channels of slave trade and began an African empire that was to be expanded under his successors. So you've got the Pasha put in place in 1805. Muhammad II becomes the Sultan in 1805. In 1811 to 1813, the Pasha, by the invitation of the Sultan, expels Wahhabis from the Hijaz. That's this area here between, in this area here of Medina and Mecca. It's an embarrassment to have the Wahhabis. They're puritanical, or you might say extreme Muslims. And so he had wanted them out. So the Pasha expels them. His son then just defeats them in their homeland. And then the Pasha goes to up the Nile River and takes part of northern Sudan here. That opens up to make him master of the slave trade, the African slave trade. Then there's the Serbian Revolution that is part of this on the line. That's from 1804 to 1817. And it's against Ottoman rule, erupted in the Balkans, running in parallel with the Napoleonic invasion. By 1817, when the revolution ended, Serbia was raised to the status of self-governing monarchy under nominal Ottoman suzerainty. I'm not sure how to say that word. In 1821, the first Hellenic Republic became the first Balkan country to achieve its independence from the Ottoman Empire. One of the other things is that after the French Revolution, there's a reference to, and I think it's in these notes as well, there's a reference to the fact that there was this spirit of revolution, and that's what was sparking this revolution throughout Europe. The Serbian Revolution, the Greek War of Independence, they're all wanting their freedom from the Ottoman Empire. So this spirit of revolution is taking place through this history. And in 1821, you have the first Balkan country gains independence from the Ottoman Empire. So at the outbreak of the Greek insurrection, so now we'll look at the Greek War of Independence against Ottoman rule. Muhammad Ali, the Pasha of Egypt, at Muhammad's request, that's the Sultan, suppressed the Cretan revolt. So the Pasha is doing the work of the Sultan is asking him to do, but at the same time, the Pasha has his own designs to continue to grow in his own strength and power, increase his own strength and power. In 1825, the Sultan again called on Muhammad Ali to suppress a local uprising, this time a nationalist revolution by Greek Christians. He was promised rule over Crete, Cyprus, and the Morea, the modern Peloponnese, for his services. His son, Ibrahim Pasha, won quick victories at the head of a conscript, that's a draft army, those that were drafted into the army, and controlled nearly the entire Peloponnesian Peninsula within 10 months of his arrival in February 1825. The Greeks continued guerrilla operations, however, and by September 1827, public opinion in Russia, Britain, and France forced the great powers to intervene in favor for the Greeks. So you've got these powers, the great powers that are described as part of that Eastern question, they are going to intervene in favor of the Greeks. The joint British, Russian, French fleet destroyed Muhammad Ali's fleet that October at the Battle of Navarino, and we already discussed that one, and this is a graphic showing the Battle of Navarino. And Ibrahim's forces were expelled from the Morea a year later following the arrival of a French expeditionary force and a settlement negotiated by the European powers. Once Ibrahim and his forces returned from Greece, preparations to wrest control of Syria began in earnest. So that's what the Pasha wants, is control over Syria. The Greek struggle for independence won considerable popular support in Britain and France. Russia was traditionally hostile to Turkey and sympathetic to its Orthodox co-religionists in Greece. Faced with the prospect of a Greek defeat and reports of massacres of the Greek population, the Allied powers each sent a naval squadron to back up their calls for an armistice. Greece came under Ottoman rule in the 15th century, in the decades before and after the fall of Constantinople. During the following centuries, there were sporadic but unsuccessful Greek uprisings against Ottoman rule. In 1814, a secret organization called the Society of Friends was founded with the aim of liberating Greece, encouraged by the revolutionary fervor gripping Europe in that period. And I made that point because what I found with the Syrian War is when there were revolutions taking place in various places in the Middle East, two of which that are mentioned quite often of significance was Tunisia, if I'm saying that right, Tunisia and Egypt. And it was that revolutionary spirit that then sparked the war in Syria. And whether or not the Syrians would want to get on board and rebel against their government. So it's that same revolutionary fervor in Europe in that period. So this society of friends planned to launch revolts in the Peloponnese, the Danubian principalities, and Constantinople itself. The insurrection was planned for the 25th of March in 1821, the Orthodox Christian feast of Annunciation. However, the plans of the Society of Friends were discovered by the Ottoman authorities, forcing the revolution to start earlier. So the first revolt began on the 6th of March or 21st of February, which calendar you're looking at, in 1821. But it was soon put down by the Ottomans. The events in the north urged the Greeks in the Peloponnese, or Morea, into action, and on the 17th of March, 1821, the Maniots were first to declare war. In September 1821, the Greeks, under the leadership of Theodoros Kolokotronis, captured Tripolisti. Revolts in Crete, Macedonia, and central Greece broke out, but were eventually suppressed. Meanwhile, makeshift Greek fleets achieved success against the Ottoman Navy and the Aegean Sea, and prevented Ottoman reinforcements from arriving by sea. So it was a battle over independence taking place within the Ottoman Empire. And it's a struggle that is taking place. And you have, within the Ottoman Empire, you have the Pasha of Egypt that is placed there by the Sultan, after to bring things back under control after Napoleon left. Now this Pasha wants to gain more and more strength and power. So you've got that battle going on within that is continuing to weaken things that now other nations, well, I don't want to say nations, but the Greeks are now wanting to be independent of the Ottoman Empire, and they're fighting for their independence. So tensions soon developed among different Greek factions, leading to two consecutive civil wars. The Ottoman Sultan called in his vassal, Muhammad Ali, who agreed to send his son Ibrahim Pasha to Greece with an army to suppress the revolt in return for territorial gains. So there's this exchange that's going to happen. The Sultan is calling the Pasha of Egypt, who's going to send his son and to help with this, but he wants in exchange territorial gains. Ibrahim landed in the Peloponnese, and we read this, but this is just another look at it, February 1825, and brought most of the peninsula under Egyptian control by the end of the year. The town, Missolonghi, fell in April 1826 after a year-long siege by the Turks. Despite a failed invasion of Mani, Athens also fell, and the revolution looked all but lost. At that point, the three great powers, Russia, Britain, and France, decided to intervene, sending their naval squadrons to Greece in 1827. So I don't know about anybody else, but I remember, I don't know, I think it was pre me being in this movement, which was the end of 2013. But I remember, all the things that were said about Uriah Smith, and then there became conspiracy theories as if this Eastern question was some sort of conspiracy. But all of it involves the literal history of 1798 going to 1840 and 1841. So understanding what that Eastern question was, it wasn't a conspiracy, it was these great powers of Europe and trying to decide what to do with the Ottoman Empire. So they decide to intervene Following news that the combined Ottoman-Egyptian fleet was going to attack the island of Hydra, the allied European fleets intercepted the Ottoman navy this was the Battle of Navarino, which we discussed a few minutes ago. After a tense week-long standoff, the Battle of Navarino led to the destruction of the Ottoman-Egyptian fleet and turned the tide in favor of the revolutionaries. In 1828, the Egyptian army withdrew under pressure of a French expeditionary force. The Ottoman garrisons of the Peloponnese surrendered, and the Greek revolutionaries proceeded to retake central Greece. Russia invaded the Ottoman Empire and forced it to accept Greek autonomy in the Treaty of Adrianople. After 9 years of war, Greece was finally recognized as an independent state under the London Protocol of February 1830. Further negotiations in 1832 led to the London Conference and the Treaty of Constantinople, and these defined the final borders of the new state and established Prince Otto of Bavaria as the first king of Greece. So the Ottoman Empire is declining and being broken up. So going back here from 1805, we have up to 1832 now, you've got the Serbian Revolution, and this leads eventually to the first Balkan country gains independence here. You have the Pasha doing the work of the Sultan at the Sultan's request to expel the Wahhabis from the Hijaz, which is the area there with Medina and Mecca. And then his son, in 1816 to 1818, goes in to defeat the Wahhabis in their own homeland, and that brings Central Arabia under Egyptian control. From 1820 to 1821, the Pasha, at the request of the Pasha conquers North Sudan, and he becomes the master of the African slave trade. And then in 1822, the Pasha is summoned by the Sultan to go and suppress the Cretan revolt. 1825, Ibrahim provokes the European powers with his military success, so he has some success against the Greeks here. And that leads to eventually 1827, the destruction of the Ottoman and Egyptian fleet at the Battle of Navarino. And we're kind of go past this part here a little bit with the Janissaries, but it was an army the Sultan wanted to set up a more modern army and to abolish the Janissary Corps. And it goes into who they were, but you can go through these notes to read the details of them. Later, over a time, it became clear that for the Ottoman Empire to restore its position as a major power of Europe, it needed to replace the Janissary Corps with a modern army. So then you also have on the line is this Russo-Turkish War, 1828 to 1829, did not give him time to recognize to organize a new army, and the Sultan was forced to use these young and undisciplined recruits in the fight against the veterans of the Tsar. The war was brought to a close by the disastrous Treaty of Adrianople. While the reforms in question were mainly implemented to improve the military, the most notable development that arose out of these efforts was a series of schools teaching everything from math to medicine to train new officers. So that was another war that also is leading up to this War of Independence. And the Russians and the Greeks together against the Ottoman Empire. So just to review it again, we kind of just went through that, but we've got the Serbian Revolt from 1804 to 1817, leads to the first Balkan country, independent of the Ottoman Empire. You've got the Pasha expels the Wahhabis from the Hijaz. You've got Ibrahim Pasha, the Pasha's son, defeats the Wahhabis in their homeland, brings Central Arabia under Egyptian control. And then you have the Pasha conquers the North Sudan, masters the African slave trade. 1822, the Pasha suppressed the Cretan revolt. 1825, Ibrahim provokes with his successes the great powers of Europe, and then that leads to the destruction of the Egyptian and Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Navarino. This is where 1826, Muhammad II, the Sultan, abolish his janissary court, and he's trying to set up a modern army, but he's not ready with his army when it comes to the Russia-Turkish war. So this is just a map of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, just taken off of Google. It just shows the as it's continuing to lose and lose and lose and wind down, and eventually going to World War I, where it loses a great deal. Okay, so I think we got into, yeah, we did get through some of this Wednesday, but we'll go through it again. This is now the invasion of Syria in 1831, because the Pasha was promised territory for his help in the Greek War of Independence. So the First Egyptian-Ottoman War, First Turco-Egyptian War, or First Syrian War, 1831 to 1833, was a military conflict between the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, brought about by Muhammad Ali Pasha's demand to the Sublime Porte for control of Greater Syria as reward for aiding the Sultan during the Greek War of Independence. As a result, Muhammad Ali's forces temporarily gained control of Syria, advancing as far north as Chania. So we're in this period here. We know that the Syrian War began in 2011, and Arab Spring was this spirit of revolution that was happening in the Middle East that eventually then sparked, and I think I have it in these notes as well, that there's a video you can pull up, yeah, because we talked about it Wednesday night, on the boy that started, I think it's called The Boy That Started. Somebody posted in the chat last time, maybe they can do that again, but the boy that started the Syrian War. They were writing graffiti and were taken and arrested and tortured. And it sprung up from Arab Spring, these revolutions that were taking place in the various places in the Middle East. Muhammad Ali Pasha is reported as planning to extend his rule to the Ottoman Empire's Syrian provinces as early as 1812, secretly telling the British consul of his designs on the territory that year. This desire was left on hold, however, as he consolidated his rule over Egypt, modernizing its government administration, public services, and armed forces, and suppressing various rebellions, including the Mamluk and Wahhabi uprisings on behalf of the Sultan. So he's working on getting Egypt set up to be able to, in part of his process, to eventually take on more territory, more control over more territory. So as far back as 1812, he has his eyes set on Syria. So on this line, it's changed up a little bit. The other details are on the previous line. This one just shows that 1811 to 1818, you've got the Wahhabi War, or the Ottoman-Saudi War. The Battle of Navarino, October 20th, 1827. You've got the Greek War of Independence. It was 1821 to 1832. And all of this bringing us to this place here, 1831, where the Pasha now wants to take control of Egypt. And there were territories, he wants it in return for his help in the Greek War of Independence. And the Mamelukes, let's see, a term most commonly referring to either non-Muslim slave soldiers, freed slaves, Muslim converts assigned to military and administrative duties, and Muslim rulers of slave origin. So the battle of this Syrian battle, it's Egypt, Muhammad Ali, Ibrahim Pasha, his son, the Ottoman Empire, you got Muhammad II, and then Resaid Muhammad Pasha. So I want to say he's the governor, the Pasha is the governor. I think this is of Syria. And this picks up later for the second Syrian War. The governor of Acre, Abdullah Pasha Ali, was harboring fugitives of the Egyptian draft and was said to have refused a request to contribute towards Muhammad Ali's war effort. With these insults as pretext, land and sea forces under the command of Ibrahim Pasha, that's the Pasha of Egypt's son, were sent north to besiege Acre in October 1831. The city fell to Ibrahim's army 6 months later in May 1832. After Acre, he continued to win control of Aleppo, Homs, Beirut, Sidon, Tripoli, and Damascus. The armies sent by the Sultan and various local governors were unable to check Ibrahim's forces. The then ongoing Tanzimat reforms of Muhammad II had experienced significant difficulties in adopting the innovative military methods of conscription, that's using a draft, so he's not able to get his army ready, and mass drill, then being implemented in European armies. But Muhammad Ali had managed to adopt both. Ibrahim's overwhelming success cannot be attributed only to modern organization, however. His officers had significantly more experience than their Ottoman counterparts, having borne the brunt of fighting in the empire's two most recent major wars against the Wahhabi and Greek rebellions, and he attracted significant local support to his cause by calling his campaign one for liberation from the Turkish yoke. With the provinces of Greater Syria under his control, the Egyptian army continued their campaign into Anatolia in late 1832. Then you have the Battle of Chania. On November 21st, 1832, the Egyptian forces occupied the city of Chania in central Anatolia, within striking distance of the imperial capital of Constantinople. The Sultan organized a new army of 80,000 men under Rashid Mohammed Pasha, the Grand Vizier, in a last-ditch attempt to block Ibrahim's advance towards the capital. While Ibrahim commanded a force of 50,000 men, most of them were spread out along his supply lines from Cairo, and he had only 15,000 in Chania. So he's going up 15,000 up against 80,000 in this battle. Nevertheless, when the armies met on December 21st, Ibrahim's forces won en route, capturing the Grand Vizier after he became lost in a fog attempting to rally the collapsing left flanks of his forces. The Egyptians suffered only 792 casualties compared to the Ottoman army's 3,000 dead, and they captured 46 of the 100 guns with which the army had left Istanbul. If anybody has a question, somebody go ahead and speak up because I can't see the chat. I think somebody else just posted the video earlier, but if anybody has questions, go ahead and speak up. The stunning victory at Chania would be the final and most impressive victory of the Egyptian campaign against the Sublime Porte, and would represent the high point of Muhammad Ali's powers in the region. So if we can see, there's this internal struggle in the Ottoman Empire, while you've got externally, well, the Greeks are now independent. Externally, there are the great powers that are getting involved in this as well. In the aftermath, though no military forces remained between Ibrahim's army and Istanbul, severe winter weather forced him to make camp at Chania long enough for the Sublime Porte to conclude an alliance with Russia and for Russian forces to arrive in Anatolia, blocking his route to the capital. The arrival of a European power would prove to be too great a challenge for Ibrahim's army to overcome. Wary of Moscow's expanding influence in the Ottoman Empire and its potential to upset the balance of power, French and British pressure forced Muhammad Ali and Ibrahim to agree to the Convention of Chania. Under the settlement, the Syrian provinces were ceded to Egypt, and Ibrahim Pasha was made the governor general of the region. The treaty left Muhammad Ali a nominal vassal of the Sultan. 6 years later, when Muhammad Ali moved to declare de jure independence, the Sultan declared him a traitor and sent an army to confront Ibrahim Pasha, launching the Second Ottoman War. And that's where this story leaves off. And the Second Ottoman War is another study that I haven't I haven't finished yet. So now we're going to go into the Syrian War today, and why is there a war in Syria? And it's if anybody has comments along the way, if you put them in the chat, I don't get to see them, so do speak up. But if you have thoughts on any of this study as we go through it and are working on any of it yourself, feel free to share in email if you would, as we work together to try to put the lines together and find the key events, and being able to understand them as a parable and what they're teaching us today. There are some thoughts about that with this all leads, it's all wrapped around Islam in the Middle East, just as this was wrapped around Egypt and Syria and Turkey. So there is light to be found when it comes to Islam and the restraint of Islam, and when does Islam actually strike? So I put in the chat, the WhatsApp chat the other day, if anybody remembered the presentation in Portugal where Elder Parminder was talking about 9/11, because he points out that 9/11 was a harbinger, using several quotes. One of them was 9T, and I don't remember the references. Maybe somebody else quickly remembers the references. And I think Sister Catherine McGraw's here, so she was there. So she might understand this better. But that, and it was titled, was 9/11 necessary? And what he was showing and proving is that in those passages on Nashville, taking the Nashville passage and taking the New York buildings passage, and showing that they were the close of probation, the big close of probation, when all that destruction happens. And so some thoughts that I had, this is kind of sidestep of this study, but to put out there for other people to think about, and if you have any comments on, that we also have been studying the deadly wound, the death, and the resurrection of the King of the South, 1989, 1991. And then there's a resurrection, which I think is placed at 1999. But then we take 1989 and 91 and place it at Panium 2021 in Sunday Law. So there's a deadly wound we know at Panium, and then at Sunday Law is the death. We know from the study of Acts 27 that the south wind blows first, and it's a favorable wind that they, under those conditions, to sail. And so under the winds, under the south wind, it's favorable wind. But Euroclydon, the east wind, follows. So I'm still trying to work on that. I don't know if anybody else has looked at that. What does that mean about taking what Elder Parminder laid out, that the close of probation, that 9/11 was a harbinger for the close of probation and that great destruction, taking the death and deadly wound and the death of the King of the South, and seeing that at 2021 to Sunday Law, and if that's the south wind blowing favorably, where does that leave Islam to strike? Those are some questions that I'm kind of asking, and I don't know if anybody's ever given that any thought. And I probably didn't ask the question directly because I really don't want to say it directly right now. I'm not certain of it, and I want to be, I just thought if anybody's had some of those thoughts as to where do they strike, because there are lines that show strikes, and I don't know if the lines are, if we have all the lines right, but some of the lines show a strike of Islam at midnight at 2021. So anyways, just some things that I've been thinking about that this study has prompted in my mind to think about. So here's a map then again of the area of the anti-Assad. On the anti-Assad side, you've got Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United States, the European Union, and the Arab League. And Syria's allies are Iran, Russia, and then China. And this kind of comes gradually as we go through this study. You'll see it kind of comes gradually, where at first it's just civil war Syria, and then everybody starts to jump in, and then Islam jumps in. So how did the Syrian War start? Even before the conflict began, many Syrians were complaining about high unemployment, corruption, and lack of political freedom under President Bashar al-Assad, who succeeded his father after he died in 2000. In March 2001, pro-democracy demonstrations erupted in the southern city of Diriyah, inspired by the Arab Spring in neighboring countries. So that was the connection that I was seeing, that is that revolutionary spirit that brought about the Greek War of Independence, and it all played a role in leading up to the Syrian War. So you've got that spirit of revolution and Arab Spring. Arab Spring, mainly what I've seen is where the revolution in Egypt, the revolution in Tunisia. And so when the government used deadly force to crush the dissent, protests demanding the president's resignation erupted nationwide. The unrest spread and the crackdown intensified. Opposition supporters took up arms, first to defend themselves and later to rid their areas of security forces. Mr. Assad vowed to crush what he called foreign-backed terrorism. The violence rapidly escalated and the country descended into civil war. So January 2001, you have the onset of these anti-regime protests. In March, you've got the first major protest. It was in the impoverished, drought-stricken rural province of Dara in southern Syria that the first major protest occurred in March 2001. A group of children had been arrested and tortured by the authorities for writing anti-regime graffiti. Incensed local people took to the street to demonstrate for political and economic reforms. Security forces responded harshly, conducting mass arrests and sometimes firing on demonstrators. The violence of the regime's response added visibility and momentum to the protesters' cause, and within weeks, similar nonviolent protests had begun to appear in cities around the country. Videos of security forces beating and firing at protesters captured by witnesses on mobile phones were circulated around the country and smuggled out to foreign media outlets. Another thing, that there was a few videos, there's several videos you can watch on this. Some of them are on Frontline, on the Syrian War. Other one, just Google Syrian War and YouTube, and you'll find several videos that'll go through this. I don't remember which one it was that I watched, but they showed the emphasis of the use of the internet and social media for their causes, which also is linked to what we understand as information war, the rise of the internet in 1989. So this tool allowed them to be able to do things like what we see on Facebook today, when we're understanding that Facebook is used to bring two opposing factions to the same place to do their protests at the same time. So they were using Facebook to call together their protests and rallies and such, and they were using Facebook and social media to communicate the things that were happening and to be able to show actual video of what was happening. So what is the war about? It's now more than a battle between those who fought for or against Mr. Assad. Many groups and countries, each with their own agendas, are involved, making the situation far more complex and prolonging the fighting. They have been accused of fostering hatred between Syria's religious groups, pitching the Sunni Muslim majority against the president's Shia Alawite sect. Such divisions have led both sides to commit atrocities, torn communities apart, and dimmed hopes of peace. They have also allowed the jihadist groups, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, to flourish. Syria's Kurds, who want the right of self-government but have not fought Mr. Assad's forces, have added another dimension to the conflict. So you've got this internal, just within Syria, that begins, but sparks all these other parties to get involved. The government's key supporters have been Russia and Iran, while Turkey, Western powers, and several Gulf Arab states have backed the opposition. Russia, which already had military bases in Syria, launched an air campaign in support of Mr. Assad in 2015 that has been crucial in turning the tide of the war in the government's favor. The Russian military says its strikes only target terrorists, but activists say they regularly kill mainstream rebels and civilians. Iran is believed to have deployed hundreds of troops and spent billions of dollars to help Mr. Assad. Thousands of Shia Muslim militiamen, armed, trained, and financed by Iran, mostly from Lebanon's Hezbollah movement, but also Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen, have also fought alongside the Syrian army. The US, UK, and France initially provided support for what they considered moderate rebel groups, but they have prioritized non-lethal assistance since jihadists became the dominant force in the armed opposition. A US-led global coalition has also carried out airstrikes on ICE, the Islamic State militants in Syria since 2014, and helped an alliance of Kurdish and Arab militias called the Syrian Democratic Forces capture territory once held by the jihadists in the east. Turkey has long supported the rebels, but it has focused on using them to contain the Kurdish militia that dominates the Syrian Defense Forces, accusing it of being an extension of a banned Kurdish rebel group in Turkey. Turkish-backed rebels have controlled the territory along the border in northwestern Syria since 2016. Saudi Arabia, which is keen to counter Iranian influence, has armed and financed the rebels as the kingdom's Gulf rival, Qatar. Israel, meanwhile, has been so concerned by what it calls Iran's military entrenchment in Syria and shipments of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah that it has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in an attempt to thwart them. So there are many players, and it's hard to follow all of them, at least for me. Maybe some follow it better, but there are many players involved, but it's a proxy war. But it's a war about two different factions of Islam overall, from the big picture. Those that are fighting for democracy and those that are fighting for extreme religious government. From early on, the uprising and the regime's response had a sectarian dimension. Many of the protesters belonged to the country's Sunni majority, while the ruling Assad family members were of the country's, I don't know how to say the Alawite minority. Alawites also dominated the security forces and the irregular militias that carried out some of the worst violence against protesters and suspected opponents of the regime. Sectarian divisions were initially not as rigid as is sometimes supposed, though the political and economic elite with ties to the regime included members of all of Syria's confessional groups, not just Alawites, while many middle and working class Alawites did not particularly benefit from belonging to the same community as the Assad family and may have shared some of the protesters' socio and economic grievances. So even within the group that Assad supports or is part of, there's those that are not benefiting the poorer class that are also going in these grievances. So it's very complicated to all these different parties that are involved. As the conflict progressed, however, sectarian divisions hardened. In his public statements, Assad sought to portray the opposition as Sunni Islamic extremists in the mold of Al-Qaeda and as participants in foreign conspiracies against Syria. The regime also produced propaganda stoking minorities' fears that the predominantly Sunni opposition would carry out violent reprisals against the non-Sunni communities. As the protest increased in strength and size, the regime responded with heavier force. In some cases, this meant encircling cities or neighborhoods that had become hubs of protest, such as Banias or Homs, with tanks, artillery, and attack helicopters and cutting off utilities and communications. In response, some groups of protesters began to take up arms against the security forces. In June, Syrian troops and tanks moved into the northern town of Jisr al-Shagur, sending a stream of thousands of refugees fleeing into Turkey. So you got the onset of the anti-regime protest. The first major protest began in March, and then by June you have refugees fleeing to Turkey. By the summer of 2011, Syria's regional neighbors and global powers had both begun to split into pro and anti-Assad camps. So you've got regional neighbors and global powers that are now coming in in just a few short months, coming in and being a part of this. The United States and the European Union were increasingly critical of Assad as his crackdown continued, and US President Barack Obama and several European heads of state called for him to step down in August of 2001. An anti-Assad bloc consisting of Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia formed in the last half of 2011. The United States, the EU, and the Arab League soon introduced sanctions targeting senior members of the Assad regime. Meanwhile, Syria's long-standing allies, Iran and Russia, continued their support. An early indicator of the international divisions and rivalries that would prolong the conflict came in October 2001, when Russia and China cast the first of several vetoes blocking a UN Security Council resolution that would have condemned Assad's crackdown. So this was going to prolong the conflict with what Russia and China did in vetoing the UN from blocking a condemnation of Assad. Late 2001 and early 2012 saw a series of ill-fated efforts by international organizations to bring the conflict to an end. In early November of 2001, Syrian officials agreed to an Arab League initiative calling for the Syrian government to stop violence against the protesters, remove tanks and armored vehicles from cities, and release political prisoners. In December 2001, the Syrian government agreed to permit a delegation of monitors from the Arab League to visit Syria to observe the implementation of the plan. The observer mission, these that are going to come in and observe that they're doing what they're supposed to do, quickly lost credibility with the opposition, as it became clear that not enough monitors and equipment had been sent, and that the Syrian government had presented the monitors with orchestrated scenes and restricted their movements. Amid concerns for the monitors' safety, the Arab League ended the mission on January 28. So you have the regional neighbors and the global powers begin to take sides. September, you have rebel militias engage with the Syrian government. October, you have Russia and China cast the first veto in the UN to block the attack on Assad. A second agreement, this time brokered by former UN Secretary Kofi Annan and sponsored by the UN and Arab League, produced a short partial ceasefire in April 2012. So April, you have a partial ceasefire here in 2012, but violence soon resumed and reached higher levels than before. And the UN team of monitors, like the Arab League predecessors, had to be withdrawn for security reasons. Having had little success in creating peace between the combatants themselves, the UN and the Arab League sought to enlist the international powers in support of political settlement to the conflict. In June 2012, an international conference organized by the UN produced the Geneva Communique, which provided a roadmap for negotiations to establish a transitional governing body for Syria. The United States and Russia were unable to agree on whether Assad would be included in future Syrian government, so this was left unspecified. Again, any questions? Are you guys following? I know it's a lot of history and a lot of details, and I don't want to lose anybody. Interactive is always better. hopefully the silence isn't because you've gone to sleep.
It's always hard to grapple with. This is the first time you hear it.
It's
It's
very-
like learning. It's like learning about the Diadochi Wars all over again.
It is, and I, I am so
Oh.
weak in history. I'm so weak in
Join the
all
crowd.
of this, and I thought the only way to do it is to dig in and find the events and put them on a line.
It's like I have to kind of like go over it slowly again, because at the rate you're going, it's like my brain just is not keeping
And I'm
up.
even trying to go slow. I apologize for that. I'm even trying to go slow and just kind of review it along the way on the line, because what we want to do is maybe not every event on the line is one that is going to be of great significance to line up with the past history. But what my prayer is that we'll find the ones that are the significant changes, and we'll see actually, because we come into eventually, you get into 2013 when then ISIS now gets involved, and it's interesting to see what happens when they get involved, because I picture it. Those, I think most of us, at least in America, has shared this with Brother Italo, but it's like they all pigpiled on ISIS, everybody. And so here they all are fighting each other, but when ISIS came in, it seemed like everybody went after ISIS to get them out of there. And that was when, in 2014, when al-Baghdadi wanted to, or did proclaim the Islamic State. So they all jumped in to push back. And I have a map of that later towards the end of the study, of the significance in getting ISIS retreated out of there. So yeah, it is a lot of history. That's why I am trying to go slow. I'll try to slow it down a little bit more.
There had another comment. Wherever you see within the paragraphs, wherever you see the number 2011, you are saying 2001.
Oh, did I? Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll try to be better at that. Thank you.
Thought I'd let you know.
Thank you. Yeah, for people that are listening and not watching, they would thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So 2011 to 2021 is what we know. Thank you. So by early 2012, it was becoming clear that the Syrian National Council, an opposition umbrella group formed in Istanbul in August 2011, was too narrow and too weakened by infighting to effectively represent the opposition. Much of the infighting was the result of cross-cutting streams of support flowing to different rebel factions as donor countries' efforts to prioritize their own agendas and maximize their influence over the opposition created conflicts and prevented any single group from developing the stature to lead. After months of contentious diplomacy, in November, Syrian opposition leaders announced the formation of a new coalition called the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces. Over the next month, the coalition received recognition from dozens of countries as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. The divisions and rivalries that had plagued the Syrian National Council were nevertheless still present in the new organization. And like I mentioned at the beginning, the several of the articles that I shared in the email as well, they take on more, a bigger, broader picture of this when you start looking at Putin and his activities and how he is trying to win over the Sultan from the Saudi Arabia's relations with the U.S. to win him over to Russia. So there's a lot of details in that would just make this explode and we never get through it. So I encourage you to take a look at some of those articles and see about him not becoming a member of OPEC, but he became kind of a party in OPEC. I don't know the distinction. Somebody posted that in the chat for me last time too. So he didn't actually become a full member, but he became a part of it to where they were working together in controlling the price of oil. So, and then it brings in COVID-19 into it, and what we saw a few months back with that standoff that was going on between them. So there's a lot of articles that go into these outside forces, because what we're seeing here is the Middle East portion of it, but keep in mind that it's a proxy war between the King of the North and the King of the South, and who is on which side. So the summer and fall of 2012 saw a string of tactical successes for the rebels. Government troops were forced to withdraw from areas in the north and east, allowing the rebels to control significant territory for the first time. In July, rebels attacked Aleppo, Syria's largest city, establishing a foothold in the eastern part of the city. By early 2013, though the military situation appeared to be approaching stalemate, rebel fighters kept a firm hold on northern areas, but were held back by deficiencies in equipment, weaponry, and organization. Meanwhile, government forces, weakened by defections, also seemed incapable of making large gains. Daily fighting continued in contested areas, pushing the civilian death toll higher and higher. So you see Aleppo here, where the rebels gained some control of the city. And this is all the, says here, all the contested areas here. I'm showing each one of the breakdown of who's who. So they win, the rebels win part of the city of Aleppo here, but now both are weakened, rebels by their lack of weaponry and organization, and also the government because of defections. With no decisive outcome in sight, the international allies of the Syrian government and the rebels stepped up their support, raising the prospect of a regional proxy war. Efforts by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar to fund and arm rebels became increasingly public in late 2012 and 2013. The United States, which had been reluctant to send weapons for fear of inadvertently arming radical jihadists who would someday turn against the West, eventually started a modest program to train and equip a few vetted rebel groups. The Syrian government continued to receive weapons from Iran and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah. By late 2012, Hezbollah had also begun sending its own fighters into Syria to battle the rebels. And I know we talked about this before. Most of us, I think, already know, but in case anybody doesn't, to the Frontline Videos, Bitter Rivals. I think it's about 3 hours. It's in 2 parts and about 3 hours long. Are good videos to study and understand the Sunni and the Shia, the war between the two. And also then the one called The Crown Prince that goes into the journalist Khashoggi's death as well. And then also, like I said, you can go onto YouTube and do a search for videos on the Syrian War. And to me, I've been spending the last probably month looking at some of this. And so some of it's finally starting to sink in and be able to at least get to know who's who. That was a huge part for me. There's so many players involved in just understanding who's who. So let's see, I can't remember if I read this. The Syrian government continued to receive weapons from Iran. Yeah, okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Sorry, I just stepped out, but I was listening from a distance, and you said something about COVID-19 being in relation to this. Could you repeat that?
That's in relation to where Putin, Russia, got involved with OPEC. They're not a full member, and I know somebody posted something. It might have been Sister Christine. I just can't see the chat, but she might have posted the same thing from the other night. But he's not a full member, but he's acting with them. I don't. Maybe she's posted it there, and somebody speak up if it is there, how to word it correctly.
Bitter Rivals Part 1. She just posted.
Okay. So there's so the OPEC is a group that work together to keep the price of oil high, if I understood it correctly, but they all have to work together to how many barrels per day that they produce, et cetera, in order to control the price of oil. COVID-19 came in, and there's a decrease in what's needed. So they wanted, if somebody else may say this better than I do, they might have a better understanding of it, but they needed to decrease their production. And a couple of those articles that I posted talked about that more in detail, that they needed to decrease production. Russia, in one of the articles, it was saying Russia does not have there were a couple of factors, and I can't remember the factors, but the necessary equipment, and I think it had to do with their climate as well. I don't remember what it was, but they can't just turn off their drilling and then restart it back up. So that puts them at a little bit of a disadvantage to try to decrease. So they wound up still producing as many oil barrels, and then they're just lying about it and saying that they're not doing it. So there's a whole lot that was going on in there, but you have to go even beyond that to look into Putin wanting to go and make friends with Saudi Arabia and try to win Saudi Arabia. So down to spheres of influence, he wants to win Saudi Arabia in his sphere of influence.
Do you also take into consideration the gigantic oil spill, or was it a diesel spill in Siberia? That really wasn't talked much about in the news. A little bit it was, and it was just a couple of months ago or a month ago or something.
I don't know.
It was a huge thing. Okay.
But I might try to look into it later.
Yeah, okay.
In Siberia?
Yeah,
Yeah, I've heard about that one.
What was that?
About the oil spill. Yeah, I've heard about that one. That did happen. I just also wanted to mention that, the reason why also is that it's important to sell the oil that they're that they're drilling, they're getting from it's because the oil also gets bad, so it can't just stay there. Like once you get the oil, you have to distribute it. You know what I mean? It can't stay too long. It goes bad.
Yeah, it was one of those articles was talking about what Russia versus Saudi Arabia, a price that Russia would have to maintain $40 to $45 a barrel versus Saudi Arabia about $85 a barrel. But that Saudi Arabia has so many other expenditures going on that they could reduce their spending and be okay, whereas the entire budget in Russia is dependent on that. So Russia stands to lose a lot. So there's a lot of information in those articles that just add to this. I just haven't figured out where to work it in. But Russia stands to lose a lot in his getting involved with the agreement with OPEC. And that there's a couple of the articles that word it that he's probably bit off more than he chewed. I don't know if it said it that way, gambled and losing. So he took if I understood it correctly, he's kind of taken a big risk to he's got all these, the spheres of influence he does, and he wants Saudi Arabia as well, that he probably bit off more than he can chew, and will probably have something to do with his downfall. So leading to his deadly wound. So that's why I say a lot of back at the very beginning, that when it comes to Napoleon wanting to go weaken the access of British trade with India and strengthen his own relations with India, that you have the same thing happening when it comes to oil. Is the king of the north and the king of the south are battling for this control over the Mediterranean. There's so many other things involved, and I don't even think we'll get to there, but one of the very last slides, I just kind of had some of the old slides from the Brazil class on the proxy war about the oil drilling, that because all that's going on at the same time, where Obama said that he wanted to try to lessen trying to think of the right words how to say it, lessen the dependency of Europe off of Russian oil, and they wanted to drill that pipeline. And Iran said, it was Iran or Syria, I don't remember which one, said no, because they would have to go through their country. And then I think it's Iran then that goes and proposes to build one. And I think that's something that's in the works. And all of that was part of, should just remind me, I forgot to send the file to somebody that asked for it. If everybody remembers in Kenya, when Elder Tess laid out, she laid out, I'm trying to think how to describe it because it was different than what we're looking at, but how we're looking at this, but it was a line that was drawn out for 2014, 2015, 2016, and it showed all the different steps of Russia gaining, and then leading up to 2019. So the fulfillment of 2019, where he gained strength and gained power. So, so he's done that, but he also seems from some of the articles that we're reading and seeing is that he took on more than he can handle, and he can't afford all that he has taken on, which may be his demise. So I'll have to look into what you just said about the Siberian one, about why and how. So, and I don't know what time we stop, Sister Adriana. We kind of changed schedules, so I'm trying, don't we usually stop at 1:30? So it would be 12:30, is that right?
Yeah, you put on your schedule 12:30.
Okay. Doesn't mean I remembered it. I was just trying to back myself up an hour. So we'll finish at 12:30, okay. So, okay, so there were new calls for international military action in Syria after suspected chemical weapons attacks in the suburbs of Damascus killed hundreds on August 21st, 2013. The Syrian opposition accused pro-Assad forces of having carried out the attacks. Syrian officials denied having used chemical weapons and asserted that if such weapons had been used, rebel forces were to blame. While UN weapons inspectors collected evidence at the sites of the alleged chemical attacks, US, British, and French leaders denounced the use of chemical weapons and made it known that they were considering retaliatory strikes against the Assad regime. Russia, China, and Iran spoke out against military action, and Assad vowed to fight what he described as Western aggression. So August of 2013, you have a chemical weapons attack that kills hundreds.
Yeah, I have a comment on that thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was under the impression back when it was a conspiracy theory from the West saying that it wasn't true with the chemical weapons.
Oh, yeah.
You probably remember it was all over the news anyway, here in America, that they were trying to drum this up as chemical attacks so that it would benefit Syria or themselves.
Yeah.
Syria, but it was against Syria, and it was true. And it was turned into a conspiracy theory.
That Syria did the attacking, or that Syria was attacked with chemical weapons?
That Syria did the attacking.
Yeah, right. Yeah. A preliminary U.S. government assessment determined that 1,429 people were killed in the chemical weapons attack, including at least 426 children. Though this assessment will certainly evolve as we obtain more information. That was an older article on it. And I think I have a duplicate slide here. Oh, no, we don't. Okay.
Yeah, that's good. It definitely good to know from past thinking.
Yeah, it was, yeah. Okay, so the prospect of international military intervention in Syria began to fade by the end of August, in part because it became evident that majorities in the United States and the United Kingdom were opposed to military action. A motion in the British Parliament to authorize strikes in Syria failed on August 29th, and a similar vote in US Congress was postponed on September 10th. Meanwhile, diplomacy took center stage, resulting in an agreement between Russia, Syria, and the United States on September 14th to place all of Syria's chemical weapons under international control. The agreement was carried out and all declared chemical weapons were removed from Syria by the agreement's deadline of June 30th of 2014. So just following along the line, the first onset of the anti-regime protests began January 2011. March 2011, you have the first major protests. In June, you have the refugees these refugees fleeing to Turkey. In the summer of 2011, you have regional neighbors and global powers begin to take sides. In September, you have rebel militias engaged with the Syrian government. In October 2011, Russia and China cast their first UN veto UN against trying to go out and attack, not attack, but I'm trying to remember how it said it, against Assad, that he was actually doing the things that he's doing, and they are defending him. In April 2012, there's a partial ceasefire. 2012, the Geneva Communique. I can't see the top here. Hang on one second. Okay. June of 2012 was the Geneva Communique. In November 2012, you have National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces. In late 2012 to 2013, international support is more and more public, and Hezbollah also sends fighters. August 21st, 2013, Syria uses chemical weapons on hundreds. September 14 of 2013, Russia, Syria, and US agree to place chemical weapons under international control. Okay. In 2013, Islamist militants began to take center stage as the non-Islamist factions faltered from exhaustion and infighting. The Nusra, I don't know how you say that, Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda affiliate operating in Syria, partnered with a variety of other opposition groups and was generally considered to be one of the most effective fighting forces. But it was soon overshadowed by a new group. In April 2013, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, declared that he would combine his forces in Iraq and Syria under the name Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, ISIL, also known as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. He evidently intended for the Nusra Front to be part of the new group under his command, but the Nusra Front rejected the merger and the two groups ended up fighting with each other. And this was an interesting thing too when you go back before Baghdadi with Zarqawi. I think he was killed in 2005, but he was seen, there's a couple of videos that on YouTube you can find about him as well. I don't remember which ones they were in. And if anybody wants them, I'll try to find them again. But in 2005, I believe that Zarqawi was killed. But even bin Laden saw him as too radical. He wanted to be a part of Al-Qaeda. But what they eventually began doing was, and it takes me back thinking about the Mamelukes, who were, what is the Mamelukes? They were the puritanical force, no, the Wahhabis, sorry, the Wahhabis. They were this puritanical force. They were extreme religious Muslims, this extreme in their religion and extreme in their, like the beheadings and the and live under this law and or die. Anyways, so when they got involved, they were actually killing other Muslims, and that was, and if you look at it, to bring them to the point to declare the Islamic State. So the extremism part comes in here in the midst of the Syrian war, and you wind up with Muslims killing other Muslims. So the best way I can understand it is there's total chaos going on and a lot of people dying because of it. So anyways, so then we have in eastern Syria, ISIL seized an area in the Euphrates Valley centered on the city of al-Raqqa. From there, ISIL launched a series of successful operations in both Syria and Iraq, expanding to control a wide swath of territory straddling the Iraq-Syria border. ISIL's sudden advances in Iraq, which were accompanied by a steady stream of violent and provocative propaganda, added urgency to the international community's calls for action. On August 8th, the United States launched airstrikes to Iraq to prevent ISIL from advancing into autonomous Kurdish region in northern Iraq and to shield Christian and Yazidi communities there. The strikes slowed the group's advance, but a series of videos showing ISIL fighters beheading Western aid workers and journalists amplified fears that the group posed a global threat. So now we're seeing that they're proposing a global threat. On September 23rd, the United States and coalition of Arab states expanded the air campaign to strike ISIL's targets in Syria. So when they get involved, they start taking, occupying territory and controlling territory, eventually to then what they then declare in 2014 to declare an Islamic State. So then the US strikes in Iraq against ISIL here. Let's see here. Oh, that's a different one, sorry. So let's keep going. So in the summer of 2015, Russia began to take a more active role in the conflict, deploying troops and military equipment to an airbase near Latakia. In September, Russia launched its first airstrikes against targets in Syria. Russian officials originally claimed that the airstrikes were targeting ISIL, but it quickly became clear that they were targeting mostly rebels fighting against Assad with the intention of bolstering their ally. So they seem to go in there under the pretense of trying to show that they're against terrorism as well, but they're really fighting against the rebels and helping Assad. That picture made me really sad when I saw it. The reality of what all this causes, just the blank stare on that boy's face was striking to me for some reason or another. And the innocence of people in this world that are suffering because of greed and power and selfishness.
It's so unfortunate, isn't it? So heartbreaking.
Yeah, yeah. After a short ceasefire between Russian and Syrian government forces and Western-backed rebels collapsed in September 2016, Russia and the Syrian government forces turned their focus to the rebel-held eastern part of Aleppo. Unleashing a fierce bombing campaign, Russian and Syrian forces made no attempt to avoid causing civilian casualties in their efforts to subdue the rebels. Warplanes dropped indiscriminate munitions such as cluster bombs and incendiary bombs, and targeted medical facilities, search and rescue teams, and aid workers. Those actions were condemned by human rights groups, but they continued unabated until the rebels in Aleppo collapsed in December. By 2016, ISIL, which only a few years earlier had appeared to be nearly unstoppable in northern and eastern Syria, was beginning to collapse under the strain of its simultaneous confrontations with three rival coalitions. So ISIL has three rival coalitions that are weakening them and they're lessening their grip on the territory. And that was the Kurdish forces and their American allies, pro-Assad Syrian forces supported by Iran and Russia, and a Turkish-backed coalition of rebel groups. In the north, Kurdish and Turkish forces gradually consolidated their hold on the areas along the Turkish border, depriving ISIL of a strategically important territory. Meanwhile, an escalating US-led air campaign weakened ISIL's grip on key strongholds. ISIL's ideological rivals, including the Nusra Front, merged into HTS and together fought ISIL in Idlib, capturing territory held by ISIL in the area. In June 2017, the mostly Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces launched an assault on Al Raqqa, ISIL's de facto capital in Syria, with support from US air power and special forces. In October, the Syrian Defense Forces announced that Al Raqqa had been cleared of ISIL forces. In the east, Assad's forces continued to pressure ISIL, forcing them out of Deir al-Zoar in November 2017. So this was the one that I was talking about, that they came in about 2013, and by 2014, they're gaining all this strength and all this territory, and it's bringing them, the civil war has brought them this opportunity to come in and declare an Islamic state. And they gain strength and they gain territory, they gain control over the area. And then what this particular article shows is that yet everybody that seems like is going against to stop them, which I thought was interesting because there's so much of this that I don't understand. And I thought it was very interesting that everyone jumped after to stop them. So here's the map that shows under the how the area under ISIS control has shrunk. In 2015, how they were in Syria, in Iraq, and then it decreases each time, and this is where we're at here, which actually, and I think I have a little bit more left of these notes, because then you come to the point where Donald Trump and what that actually meant when Donald Trump removed the troops. So it's safe to say here that in 2019, which happens to be a waymark, 2019 is a waymark, you see a restraint of Islam. They have gone against them, and you bring to a restraint of Islam here in 2019, which goes back to my questions on the very beginning of, I don't think I spelled it out, this part of it, but I've been looking at and trying to study the passages on the hold until the servants of my God are served in their foreheads, because there's a restraint that's placed, we know, upon Islam. So here shows a restraint in 2019. While government forces continued to gain ground, Western governments increasingly intervened in the conflict. After a chemical weapons attack was carried out in, I'll skip that, in April 2017, the United States barraged Sharat Air Base near Homs with 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles. A year later, after the Syrian government used the chemical weapons in Douma, US, British, and French forces launched more than 100 strikes targeting chemical weapons facilities near Damascus and Homs. Dmitry S. Peskov, a spokesman for President Vladimir Putin of Russia, told reporters Friday that the strike deals a significant blow to relations between Russia and America, which are already in a poor state, according to the news agency RIA. Mr. Peskov said the strike did nothing to combat international terrorism. On the contrary, this creates a serious obstacle for building of an international coalition to fight it and to effectively resist this universal evil. Fighting terrorism was Mr. Putin's stated goal when he dispatched the Russian military to Syria in September 2015, though its main effect has been to shore up Mr. Assad. And that was also probably one of the articles that I sent out in the email. So while he claims to be wanting to counter terrorism, he's mainly helping Syria and Assad for his own gain, spheres of influence. Israel targeted the Iranian military in Syria in 2018. After Iran shelled the Golan Heights in response, Israel launched its heaviest barrage in Syria since the civil war began. Dozens of Iranian military sites were targeted, and Israel claimed to have destroyed nearly all of Iran's military infrastructure in Syria. In June 2018, having solidified their hold on the areas around Damascus and Homs, Syrian government forces began a campaign to recapture rebel-held territories in the southwest province of Dara, later expanding into Al-Qunat province. As the success of the government operation became clear, a deal was brokered with the help of Russia that allowed rebels safe passage to the rebel-held province of Idlib in the north in exchange for their surrender in the southwest of the country. And this is the one that leads up to where Donald Trump then orders the troops out of there. Idlib was the last remaining region of the country that the rebels held, and the belligerents all began to brace themselves for an imminent clash. Aside from the government's ability to now focus its military on recapturing just one region and its history using chemical weapons, Turkey's military presence in support of the rebels helped guarantee that any government offensive would be met by a tough fight. Both Turkey and the Syrian government began to amass troops along the borders. Turkey reinforced its military within the province, while Syrian and Russian warplanes bombarded border towns. So there was this great battle. They were scared of seeing the possibility of a great humanitarian crisis being this last holdout, and those people would have to then leave and flee to Turkey and cause a greater crisis. Pro-government forces are massing in Syria's northwest for what would be a large-scale offensive on Idlib province, the last opposition stronghold in the country. The UN has warned that the worst humanitarian catastrophe of this century if the attack goes ahead, since there are no remaining opposition areas to which those fleeing Idlib could be evacuated. The province is central to the outcome of the war and also the fate of the broader region. As the 7-year conflict draws to a close, each participant in the war, Syrian and non-Syrian, is trying to secure their interests, many of which run through Idlib. But few of those interests align. Most are mutually exclusive. So they're each trying to secure their interests or sphere of influence. So who's fighting who? Tahrir al-Sham remains the strongest group on the anti-Assad side, and the Turkish-backed Northern Front is also prominent. Both groups are well armed, but are no match for the Russian Air Force or aging though effective Syrian cannons and artillery pieces. Idlib is likely to be the last stand for those who fought against Assad and others who have since joined the battle. The original uprising, beginning in 2011, Arab Spring, was fed partly by a class struggle that gave rise to a protest movement, joined by nationalists, conservatives, Islamists, jihadists, who use Syria as a platform for broader ambitions and opportunities in search of power at any cost. It's amazing to think of what all can happen because of one country that has its inner conflict. It's interesting as we see the United States embroiled in this very same inner conflict. I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but you've got all these protesters and all these riots and what the outcome could actually be. Russia and Turkey attempted to de-escalate the situation by agreeing to and implementing a buffer zone between rebel and government forces. The buffer zone required all heavy weaponry and fighters to retreat from an area about 9 to 12 miles, 15 to 20 kilometers wide. It was unclear at the time whether all parties would observe the deal, a top-down agreement. The Syrian government and mainstream rebel groups, such as the Free Syrian Army, quickly embraced the buffer zone agreement. Groups sympathetic to al-Qaeda's ideology, such as HTS, remained wildcards, though they appeared to signal that they would comply. They quietly pulled heavy weaponry from the buffer zone, though many fighters appeared to remain past the October 15th deadline. As part of the agreement, Turkey was responsible for preventing the most radical groups, such as HTS, to prosper in the region. HTS, however, launched an offensive against other rebel groups in January 2019 and soon became the dominant force in Idlib. In April, Syrian forces crossed the buffer zone and began an offensive in Idlib with the help of Russian airstrikes. They captured territory before a counteroffensive launch in June was able to push the battle back into government-controlled areas. In October, the conflict expanded eastward. Turkey launched an offensive into Syria's Kurdish-held northeast region days after the United States announced that it would not stand in the way. The country aimed to destabilize Kurdish separatists in Syria, who were allies of the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey, and to make a safe zone in the region for the repatriation of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Kurdish forces quickly forged a deal with Assad for assistance, allowing government forces to re-enter the region for the first time since 2012. So we see this battle that is ensuing, and then this is when Trump actually removed troops and said that we weren't going to stand in the way and we weren't going to help. Trump orders withdrawal of US troops from northern Syria. Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper said Sunday that President Trump ordered a withdrawal of American forces from northern Syria, a decision that will effectively cede control of the area to the Syrian government and Russia, and could allow the resurgence of the Islamic State. So they had pushed back the Islamic State and put it out for the most part. And if I remember right, there were prisons there that they were all held in. And I know I've watched some of the videos of the refugee camps that a lot of them were placed in, the wives and families were placed in. And some of them that joined with the fighters, there was I know one of the videos I watched in some of the websites I was reading, there were those even from America, I think we've heard that before, but those that want to come back, and they realize that, like with the white supremacist thing that we were talking about earlier, that some of the backgrounds in which people come from, sometimes people wind up in something for a cause that they really don't know what the cause is, fully what the cause is, certainly not the effect. And some are honest, sincere people that got wrapped up in the wrong thing. But I know that's not the case for all of them. Some, I was talking to a customer of mine the other day, some are going to have hate, and that hate will never leave their heart, because we're being tested on our love for humanity. And some of those, like that video with the white supremacists, some of them aren't really what they're acting out, and reaching their hearts is not impossible. But then there's going to be those that are purely filled with hate, and that's a very sad place to be in this time in history. Representative Adam Kinzinger, an Illinois Republican who served in Iraq as an Air Force pilot, said that the withdrawal of the American troops from Syria is going to be terrible, and that the president was putting national security at risk. The Kurds found on Twitter, for goodness sake. The Kurds found out on Twitter, for goodness sake. And we had supported the Kurds. They were the ones that we were supporting and helping, and they're going to be left wide open to this. Mr. Kinzinger said on CBS Face the Nation, "We have left them to the wolves. And the message this is sending to our allies around the world, I think, is really going to be bad."
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I just also want to say that you're probably going to come to it anyways, I guess, I assume, but I don't know for sure. But anyway, that time period, 2019 in October last year, when Trump did this, he gave it all to Russia. He gave it all to Putin. And there's an article where he just handed it over on a silver platter. I remember reading that in the news in one of the, anyways, this is Rafia, where the king of the south wins.
Right.
Because Trump gives it all away. And I haven't heard anything recent. Maybe you have something to add, I don't know, but what's happening with the Kurds now? I read some article, a small snippet, that they're under attack. Are you adding to that? Like, I don't know.
I don't know. I'm not that far.
Oh, okay.
We're almost to the end of this particular study, and I continue to try to just go through and put the information on a line.
I gotcha. I don't want to interrupt you. I don't want to take away your thunder too, but this is excellent. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm glad it's helpful, because I was worried that it would be very hard to follow. And it's just, and I kept wanting to jump ahead to outside the dispensation that we're in and looking ahead. And I keep having to remind myself, we need to stay in the dispensation we're in and try to figure out this dispensation before we try to move to the next dispensation. So it's a wrestling match. That's why we need to understand Islam and the restraint of Islam. As FFA has put their prediction in the public record. While we know we don't have it, it's not all worked out, and the movement actually needs that information to understand the restraint of Islam, because if we're the true prophet, then it's information that we have to have. So studying this and studying Islam in it, because you can see, we saw it in 2014, that's when they built up and declared an Islamic State, and then everybody jumped in and they were restrained. But at the same time, you have Rafia going on, a whole other line, where I actually hadn't even thought about it as Rafia because I was so engrossed in this. But it is Rafia, where he hands it over to Putin. But it left the Kurds, and I don't know where they're at right now. I haven't gone that far to look where they're at right now. But yeah, there's a lot to look at to understand the restraint of Islam and the angry horse that's seeking to break loose. When does he break loose?
It puts a whole new perspective on, like you said earlier, on hold, because we've had different understandings of hold. And by looking at this history, we're going to see it in a truer light, because this is a truer understanding.
Yeah. So continuing, I just pulled a few things from this same article. Throughout the fight with the Islamic State that began in 2014, the Kurdish forces proved to be America's most able partners. But Turkey has long viewed those forces as an offshoot of what it and the United States consider a terrorist group. It has long battled inside its borders and throughout the region. So they see the Kurds and us helping them. They see us helping the terrorist group, and that the Kurds are a terrorist group. The Kurdish forces were key to breaking the Islamic State's control of territory in Syria, effectively destroying its self-proclaimed caliphate. Despite Mr. Trump's claim that the Islamic State is defeated, the fighters remain an effective insurgent force in Syria and Iraq. If the Turkish incursion into Syria breaks the power of the Kurdish force, some military officials believe the Islamic State could once again find lawless, safe havens from which to rebuild. The withdrawal from northeastern Syria is expected to become complete perhaps as early as the end of October, a military official said, but the pace of the withdrawal will depend on how quickly Turkish-backed forces advance. Some defense officials are worried that American forces could be targeted by Turkish-backed forces or other groups while they're withdrawing. Military officials warned that any attacks would be met with strong counterstrikes to deter any miscalculation by other forces. Mr. Engel said the United States should consider trying to kick Turkey out of NATO, calling President Erdogan a bad guy. I think it's something that needs to be considered, he said. How do you have a NATO ally who's in cahoots with the Russians? And then this last little part was just a reminder of, we are at 12:30. This is only a couple pages if everybody's okay, or do you want to stop?
I'm okay.
It's just a quick reminder, and it's in the notes. I just want to pull up at least the map of the proxy war. These were notes from back in Brazil, the Brazil School of the Prophets class on proxy war. So it was just showing the map of the pipeline that they wanted to set up, and the U.S. wanted when Obama said that they wanted to get Europe to be less dependent on Russian oil. So Syria has Russia's only Navy base with direct access to the Mediterranean. Qatar has the largest U.S. naval base in the area. For Qatar, allied with the U.S. to supply natural gas to Europe, it would have to go through Syria, allied with Russia. Syria knows he's trying to bypass his ally in 2009. They say no. In 2011, Iran makes the plan. The pipeline goes to go through Syria, and then they say yes, but the whole region is engulfed in civil war. So there are so many pieces to this, and I think of it a lot of times as putting together a jigsaw puzzle and to encourage us all in our studies, because the kids and I used to do jigsaw puzzles now and then. We'd get a really big one, however many thousand pieces, whatever, 5,000, I don't remember, and we would have it on the tiny room table. We never sat there and ate. And it would be there for a long time. And we'd wander through, maybe every day, looking around, putting a piece together or something. And when you're trying to work on a puzzle like that, if you spend a little bit of time and you don't find anything, you get kind of discouraged, and then you walk away. And then another time you might come and you find 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces, and you're encouraged to keep going. So this is this huge complex, all the lines of all these lines being puzzle pieces. And each one of these events is a puzzle piece. And as you put them on a line, what it does, like the puzzle, is it makes the picture clearer and clearer until we know that we have the truth. So this is just a beginning study that I'm working on, and prayerfully others to look into the role of Islam and the restraint of Islam, because the increase of knowledge in this dispensation is on Islam. We understand that. So a lot of it lies in that history of 1798 to this leading up to that Syrian War, and we only went through the first portion of it, but it's two. If I'm understanding correctly what I've seen, it's basically two Islamic factions that are fighting for superiority. One, the Sultan is the head of it all, but the Pasha, who's placed and given that title by the Sultan, is wanting to build himself up. And he's the king of the South. He's wanting to build himself up. And he wants Syria. So, and that was a literal history. So then what we need to be able to do is take that literal history in the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south, and understanding the hymn. And if I understood correctly, with our understanding of Daniel 11:40 being involving the papacy, when we look at this history does not include the papacy. The actual history, as Josiah Litch told it, the actual history that he applied Daniel 11:40 to does not include the papacy. So if I understood it correctly, the way Parminder said it is, it's another line, and another line to give us information today, and it would be on Islam. So I can't see the top of that. So we have the king of the north and the king of the south, and each of their proxies. And then ISIS is fighting on whichever side, and they're just fighting to have their own Islamic state. But we see, what I thought was interesting is how everybody, and I don't understand it, but how everybody jumped in against ISIS when they came in. and I'm not going to read through this. You guys can read through this part later, but it's just a couple of pages that were left over. But it's another line of history to look at the Daniel 11:40 as the history as Josiah Litch portrayed it and Uriah Smith copying him.
Can I
So,
ask a question?
huh?
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Okay, so do you remember when George Bush Jr., when he was in his presidency, I think in the 90s, he said, after the Twin Towers came down, this is a war on terrorism. And they were all gung-ho about setting out and getting all of the Muslim bombers for the planes that brought down the Twin Towers. But in our movement, we call it a hold on Islam, hold, right? So are we looking for the historical accounts on a war and terrorism? Is it Islam that we're looking at? Like the secular world is saying a war and terrorism. Are they always including that as Islam? I hope I'm not asking this properly, but do you know what I mean? And we're calling it a hold on Islam.
I only have my thoughts, and I don't have any answers. But I've been through my study. It led me to think, and through re-listening to the IPR camp meeting, and going back to the Portugal classes, and when he was talking about, I don't know if this is what he was saying, but when he's showing that those passages about New York and Nashville are improving, that they are the close of probation, the big close of probation, not 9/11. But that looking back, we can see it as a harbinger. And I believe that's what the word that he used, that it was a harbinger. And then, you know, in thinking about the line of the King of the South, where compare and contrast with the King of the North, you have a death, resurrection, and deadly wound, a death, and then a resurrection. And then there's going to be a deadly wound and a death, and it'll be his final death. And then going to Acts 27, that there's the south wind blows first, and then comes the east wind. And then you add in, and I don't know if I'm making any sense, but then you add in the hold. There's a loosening. And I haven't looked up the passage on the angry horse. I wanted to reread that because I don't remember exactly what it says. But is 9/11 then like a loosening and then a restraint, and then there's 4 holds, and then they're let loose? Are they the ones that the hold is placed on?
Okay.
So I've only kind of, you know, those are just thoughts that have been going through my head, and I don't know.
So August 11, 1840 was, because that's long before 9/11. And so you're saying the 4 holds are still after 9/11, like that was a loosening. So we're not going to consider August 11 as a hold?
No, August 11 was a hold.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what I've kind of found is that August 11 was a hold. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm mixing that up with Napoleon, when Napoleon was there. It's like 3 different histories to look at: Napoleon, and then 31 to 33, and then 39 to 41. So I still have them mixed up in my head. But the restraint with Napoleon was on radical Islam, if I understood it correct, because that was when the Mamelukes were there. And then you have later, they defeat the Wahhabis, right? The puritanical ones in their homeland. So all those are pieces to this, but I don't have them in place. I mean, I can see them on a line, but I don't have them put together right, if that makes sense.
Okay. So it's based on radical Islam. When Trump became president and he started putting out all of his, I don't know, what do you call them? maybe not terror seek, maybe they're called something else, I don't know. But anyways, he restricted 5 countries from coming into America. And there were 5 Islamic countries, right? Or were they some of the African countries? I can't remember. Iran was one of them. But anyways, it seemed like there was a hold on Islam from coming into America in the first 4 years of his presidency. Like right off in the beginning, he did that. And there was a big uproar worldwide about those countries because there were immigrants already in the US that had families in these countries. And it was, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Was that a hold that at that time as well? And that was in 2016.
I don't know if that's part of the hold. I mean, definitely it's internal when it comes to immigration and racism, but I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. But we can definitely see, one thing I did pick up is that 2019 seemed to suggest a hold or restraint when you see, just looking at the visual map and then reading through the notes, and anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what it appears. And in going back and forth with Brother Atabo, there's more to this. There's so many pieces to this because I need to go back and review, but there's so much to it. The Siege of Vienna is one that I know we need to look at. There was a couple of other histories that need to be looked at because all of them are going to be more and more light on this, on Islam. So the Siege of Vienna was one of them, and that I haven't looked at yet. So but that's all I do have. And thanks for bearing with me the extra time.
Can I say something really quick?
Yeah.
I don't mean to confuse anybody more than we are right now about Islam. But if you are studying or anybody else is studying, I was looking at Numbers 22 this past week, the story of Balaam and the donkey, the she-ass, that's what the Bible says. I was talking to Adriana, what is a she-ass? Is that representing a church, since it's a female? And there is a connection between the false prophet and Islam, because the ass was supposed to take the false prophet wherever he wanted to go. And in the discussion between them, she says, did I ever do this to you before? And he says, no. So there must be a connection between the false prophet and Islam. And the story happens right before the Sunday law because it is right before passing Jordan to Jericho. So it has to be in that period of time. And the way I see it, when they go, the path gets narrower and narrower until, because see, every time the angel wanted to kill the false prophet, the animal underneath him helped him. She either moved away or squeezed his leg in the wall or stooped down. She did whatever to help him not get killed. So there is a connection between these two.
Yeah, that's in the notes that Brother Atabo did. And I'm actually working on going through his notes. I think I sent them out at some point in time, and I can send them out again. He's making some revisions on a couple of things from some new light that is, more light that has come on, and when it comes to 2020 to 2021, and he has connections from not the Siege of Vienna, but I want to say 1519, I think it is. So, and he also has Numbers 22 included in his study as well. So I can send that out because he goes through the woes, and then through the woes, through Numbers 22 and the connection with Balaam, and then on into the fulfillment. And he's made several connections that I don't yet understand or see, but see just because I have to look at it myself. And so Yeah, so I can send that out too, because that we're going to actually continue on and go through his notes as well. Kind of like when we did his Civil War notes a while back. We're going to use his notes to go through as part of this study as well.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
yeah, he's put together a pretty good study, and I'll send them out. Everybody can have them now. I'm working on putting them into a slideshow, and I'm got most of the way done, or no, about halfway done, I think. And then started working on this as well. So, but that's all I have. It's late for us to break for lunch, especially those that are a couple hours ahead of us. So maybe, hey, Sister Christina, would you like to close in prayer?
Sure. Our Father who are in heaven, we thank you for your day. We thank you for the study. Please help us understand, and please give us the Holy Spirit to guide us. We're asking your blessing upon the food that we're about to eat, strengthen our body, and help us be back for the study this afternoon. In Jesus' name we ask you. Amen.
Amen.
What time do you want everybody to come back?
Are you going to put up a screen share?